This is a production of Cornell University.
Pleasure to have you here this morning. My colleague, Anthony Hay, Anthony, stand up.
Good morning.
And I are here to share with you some insights into life sciences, nanotechnology, and how it relates to bioenergy. I'm supposed to introduce myself, and I'll let Anthony introduce himself. What you need to know about me is, first and foremost, I'm a country boy from Detroit, Michigan. I'm interested in things that are green and slimy. Okay. And my role here at Cornell is orchestrating coalitions. Because to do renewable energy work, especially biofuels, requires a multidisciplinary approach. No one discipline can lead the charge of this. So this is why I have my colleague Anthony here. Anthony, introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Anthony Hay. Originally, my family's from New Zealand. We moved to Canada when I was about 10, so I call Alberta home. But I've been here at Cornell for the last 9 years, and for most of that, I've been collaborating with Larry, and he really puts his money where his mouth is. He collaborates, and I think the first meeting I ever had with Larry, I collaborate, and it's been a great opportunity to bridge disciplines. So we've worked together on student committees with undergraduates and graduate students, and it's been a great opportunity. Looking at very fundamental questions from the biological side with an engineer is really great. He's got quantitative skills that, as he says, really help to bridge the gaps when we're dealing with complex issues like biofuels and the opportunities that present themselves here. So it's a pleasure to be here with Larry today.
So I'm going to give you a formal presentation, and then we're going to open up the floor for a questions and discussion. Will that work for you folks? Okay. Thank you very much. So the title that you see here is actually a theme in a proposal that we just completed to the Department of Energy, where we brought together 17 Cornell professors from fields such as plant biology, microbiology, molecular biology, applied engineering, physics, biological engineering, material science, to bring nanotechnology and biology together for bioenergy solutions. So this is where that title falls from. And part of that is looking at some of the challenges that we're faced with in this century. And I think you all know that we are concerned about getting our oil from parts of the world that's unstable. Now, I'm going to date myself. I started in Cornell in 1979, okay, to work in energy. Interesting timing, because in 79 we had gas lines. We were concerned about energy. And so I was a young assistant professor. Okay, were you born at that time? Okay. For similar reasons. We were concerned about the embargo, the war in the Middle East, and how that would drive energy opportunities. We've got tremendous potential with the life sciences, folks. Genomics, systems biology. We've had revolutionary breakthroughs in biology. I get into arguments with Anthony about, what is real and what is science fiction. But the reality, folks, is major, major breakthroughs over the last 25 to 40 years. When I started working in energy, climate change was not on the radar as a major global driver. And it's pretty clear today that we need to develop energy systems, human systems, to cope with climate change. Global economic competition. How will the U.S. compete in a world where countries like China and India want the lead economically? And we have always turned to science and technology, innovation, to help us compete in the world. And then coming back to agriculture, some of the major breakthroughs in agriculture over the last 20 years in terms of transgenic crops. In addition, huge gains in energy efficiency within agriculture. When I started at Cornell in 1979, agriculture was consuming 3% of the national energy budget. Today, that's down to 2% of the national energy budget. So it's evolving, it's dynamic. And this is a key point that I like to get off to my colleagues, stakeholders, different audiences, that we're looking at an evolving paradigm of agriculture as a supplier of energy, fiber, and its traditional role of providing food. The big question is, how do we meet the energy and material needs of the global community and do this in a sustainable way? So you notice I've got global because we're working with global markets, and that's an important part of the equation. Let me go on record today to say that we need multiple solutions. I am not here to tell you that bioenergy is the solution to the problem. We need to have energy conservation as part of the portfolio. Oil, folks, is not disappearing. It's just going to be a little more expensive. We're going to have to look at nuclear, especially since nuclear is carbon neutral. We're going to be doing with coal. How do we deal with clean coal? Wind is going to come on the table, photovoltaic, and then we feel that there's a place for biofuels in the picture. It's not the end of the oil age. We're looking at biofuels for a very simple reason, folks. Transportation fuel. Okay, about 70% of our energy use in this country, so petroleum use, is tied to transportation. So how do we continue to meet some of the transportation needs around the course? And biomass is one of the few processes that can take petroleum out of the equation. So, is it a new paradigm? No. Henry Ford was actually looking at using ethanol to power his internal combustion engine. And Rudolf Diesel was looking at using vegetable oil. Both of these pioneers were using plant-based resources early in the development of their engines. And I like this quote from George Washington Carver. To paraphrase him, the good Lord put petroleum on the planet to buy us time to learn to use plant-based resources to meet some of our energy needs. Yes. Think about this, folks. These are folks who are 80 to 100 years in our past, and they're right there thinking where we should be going for sustainability. Some of the key assumptions that we have to make is there enough plant material to do this? And there was a report published by the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture that suggested that we have 1.3 billion tons of biomass in this country that we could translate into biofuels. If we look at ethanol as that biofuels, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of about 65 billion gallons of ethanol, which would represent about 1/3 of our transportation needs. Is it all there? No. Will we get 1/3 of our transportation need? I don't think so. Okay. Maybe we can get 25%, maybe we can get 15%, but whatever we can get is going to be important for our energy future. And that's the important message I want you to take home today. We're not trying to solve the complete transportation problem. We're trying to solve a portion of that problem. Pathways. There are multiple pathways where I can take a bushel of switchgrass to biofuels. And the two pathways that we talk about is what we call the industrial biotechnology pathway and the thermochemical pathway. And both pathways will lead to a fuel. Now, the teams that I work with are focused on the industrial biotechnology platform. Why is that? Do we think that this has no potential? No. We're playing to the strength of Cornell University. You've heard over the last 2 or 3 days about the investments they've made in the life sciences, and we believe that we can parlay some of those investments, some of the science, into biofuel. We're playing to our strengths. There are groups here in soils and crops, over in mechanical engineering, that are interested in the thermochemical platform, but we have a huge team here working the industrial biotechnology platform. This is what a standard conversion plant will look like, whether you're talking about ethanol, butanol, or hydrogen. What we have to do is take plant-based resources. It could be switchgrass, it could be willow, it could be blue stems. There's a whole spectrum of perennial grasses that we can grow here in the Northeast. We think that we can do this in polyculture. We don't feel that it's necessary to do it all around monoculture. So we think there's some really great opportunities to tap into the plant-based resources here in the Northeast, and then sending it through a series of processes to give us a fuel on this end. Okay? And many of these processes, such as the enzymatic conversion, the fermentation, relies on biology. Molecular machines, enzymes that break down the materials into simple sugars, microorganisms that are going to ferment these materials. So that's a subsystem picture of what's involved. Now, one of my key assumptions is that we're going to get through the sustainability issue because we bring really good science to the table. And we know how to do science in this country. And it's kind of frustrating now to hear this debate going on about the problems that we have in moving biofuels and other renewable energy processes forward. I'm a product of the 50s and 60s. I lived through the space program. There was a can-do attitude that we put the talent together, put the resources on the table, we could address barriers to technology development, market development. I'm still very optimistic that's what we can do, and I believe it's through good science, such as genomics, all the omics, systems biology is a new area, molecular modeling, it's all of these nice things that we do, nanobiotechnology, which we're going to talk a little bit about a little bit later, advanced bioreactors, more sophisticated control system, moving into the engineering realm, advanced system engineering tools. Because the bottom line, folks, we've got to pull together systems. It's not enough for me to do really great work at the molecular work. It's not enough for Anthony to come up with a really great microorganism or community of microorganism if we can't integrate it through the total system that we need to deliver the biofuel. So, again, I mentioned that we went to this US DOE center. We like to compete with other schools around the country to lead the charge on biofuels. It's a proposal that we submitted 2 weeks ago. If we're successful, we'll generate $5 million a year for 5 years. Those are the type of dollars that we're looking at to run an effective program in bioenergy production. And the goal of the Department of Energy is to bring the best in basic and applied science together and engineering to meet these challenges of providing sustainable, low-cost energy for this country and help us lead in the world. I want the U.S. to lead in energy technology. I want us to be competitive and compete effectively with other parts of the world. And I want to go back to our roots in science and technology to make that happen. We have to integrate this knowledge. So Anthony is a basic microbiologist, and I'm an applied engineer. Okay. You need to take fundamental concepts where there might be microbial communities, which Anthony and I have a joint interest in, or molecular machines, and then integrate that with some new tools to come up with solutions, bioenergy solutions. We're going to talk about nanotechnology as that tool today as we move into the next phase. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is what we call molecular machines. And molecular machines are enzymes that catalyzes the breakdown of materials. Now I'm having trouble. Is it my vision? Getting this started. There we go. This is cellulose, folks, that we find in all plant material, whether we talk about switchgrass, corn stover, and this is the cellulose fibers, okay? Nice bundles. Cellulose is composed of polymers of glucose. This is the molecular machine. It's called a cellulase. Nature produces many of these different cellulases to depolymerize the cellulose into simple sugars. I love this animation. Now, folks, let me underscore. This is animation. This is not the real thing, okay? But it conveys some very fundamental concept that first and foremost, this is acting on a solid structure that is crystalline and ordered. And what we're trying to do is disrupt that order to reduce sugars. So you see this chain of cellulose being fed into what we call the catalytic domain, producing these sugars, which we call cellobiols. Okay. And the microorganism we work with produces 7 of these enzymes for breaking down cellulose. This microorganism was found in a garbage heap in Mexico, okay, by a Cornell scientist by the name of Dexter Bellamy. We want to understand this whole process so that we can engineer better cellulases for breaking down cell wall materials. And so, how do you go from something like this to reality? And one of the things that we can do is that we can fluorescently tag these enzymes with a dye that will send out a signal, a light signal at different wavelengths. And then we can immobilize the cellulose using microfabrication technique like we have over in Duckville Hall, bring in some advanced optics system and focus in on these labeled enzymes on cellulose. And we get high resolution pictures. So what you see here in the green channel is cellulose that's been labeled to fluoresce green. What you see in this channel is 3 of the different enzymes that has been labeled to fluoresce red. And what you're seeing here is an overlay of the enzymes on the cellulose. We can begin to see where those enzymes are binding to the surface of the cellulose. We can observe how they're diffusing into the cellulose material. We're getting an eye on fundamental molecular mechanism, and as an engineer, I can get my kinetics. And kinetics is very much about how fast the process is going to go and to what degree it's going to go. And that ties into the bottom line of how big your reactors are going to be and how costly they're going to be. So again, taking fundamental knowledge and integrate that across the scale in terms of application. We have any science fiction buffs in the audience? Don't be bashful. I'm a big science fiction buff. Okay, okay. There was a movie that I still love to this day. It's very old, called Forbidden Planet. Okay, Walter Pidgeon was in that movie. Remember? Okay, he was the mad scientist. You know, I always gravitate towards the mad scientist. And there's a scene in there. He said, "Be prepared for a new realm of physical dimensions." And this is what we're talking about by bringing the life sciences and nanotechnology together. What you're seeing here is real now. This is not animation. This is a cellulose particle, not a fiber, but a particle, a bigger structure that is fluorescing in blue. And what you're seeing fluorescing in green are the cellulases in the pore structure of the cellulose. So we've gone from looking at what's happening on the surface of the cellulose to now looking at the pore structure and how these enzymes actually get into the pore structure. We can do that because of advanced imaging system and nanotechnology. Now this is what I really like. You see these red dots? That's clusters of individual cellulases on cellulose. My colleague Harold Craighead and I, and Harold is over in Applied and Engineering Physics, are about to generate single molecule resolution of these enzymes. So that animation that you saw earlier, we're going to actually be able to mimic by tracing how these fluorescence images actually transverse the cellulose fiber. 25 years ago, I couldn't do anything like this. These tools are opening the door for us to study molecular mechanisms that we've never been able to do before. And it's very exciting. And bringing young talent to the table. So these are 2 undergraduates in the program. Forget the red eye, folks. I haven't used Photoshop very well these days. But Jacob and Hannah are 2 Cornell undergraduates, And they have played a major role this year in producing the pure labeled enzymes that we use in the research program. So the other fun part of doing this, and Anthony will talk about this a little bit later, is that we can get these bright undergraduates, usually if we can get them in the freshman or sophomore year and keep them in the lab, we can get some really great training with them, and they're so much fun. Okay, they keep you young. So I talked about enzymes. The other part of that is microbiology. Okay, the world is full of interesting microbial systems that we should be tapping for food, energy, and fiber. And how do you begin this together in a systematic way from producing ethanol in a fermenter? This is a project I do with our dean, Susan Henry. Susan Henry is a premier yeast molecular biology. Most of the time I'm talking with Susan, it's not about administrative issues, but we get into arguments about science. Okay. And those of you who know Susan know those arguments can get very intense. Okay, which I enjoy. So how do you bring biology from a system perspective, from an energy perspective, from a reactor standpoint to make things happen? Okay, how do we exploit some of the beauties within nature? This is some work that Anthony has been working on with biofilms. I can't get it to rotate, Anthony. No? Okay.
Oh, well.
All right, we'll move on. This is a biofilm. Microorganism growing on solid surface in cluster. It can be a single species or it can be multiple species. Now, in some circles, biofuels are bad news because they file pipes, surfaces of ships. But Anthony keeps telling me that these biofuels are a great place to prospect for enzymes, microorganisms for bioconversion. And if we can understand how these communities are interacting on solid substrate and manage that interaction, we might come up with some bioenergy solutions for this. The other part of this is that we're looking at advanced imaging systems to make this happening. Again, bringing advanced imaging, nanotechnology to the table. Prospecting for these enzymes and microorganisms. Folks, this is my garbage pile again. Okay, I'm into things green and slimy, so you have to forgive me. Okay, but another angle. This is switchgrass here in the bottom picture. Do you see that those spots on there? Fungal pathogens that attack plant cell wall. There's a whole spectrum of them. Now think about it for a moment. If you got a microorganism that's very aggressive in attacking plant cell walls, it must have a really great set of enzymes to do that. So how do you begin to prospect in the world of plant pathogens to find novel enzymes, novel microorganisms for industrial biotechnology? A lot of good stuff when it's green and slimy out there. Another area of prospecting, okay, volcanic vents in the Mediterranean and Pacific. Lots of life around these volcanic vents. How do we begin to understand life processes at temperatures of 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit? And we're working with a microorganism called Thermatoga neapolitan that was discovered in 1986 off the coast of Italy that operates at these very, very high temperatures, and it produces hydrogen. Okay, thermostable at high temperature and produces hydrogen. Very important for industrial applications. So, how do we begin to discover more and more of these microorganisms? Well, Anthony and I have an interest in an area called molecular ecology. How do you use the tools of molecular biology, DNA sequencing, DNA quantification to discover new enzymes, new metabolic pathways? Okay. And one of the things that we're interested in is how do we bring nanotechnology. So I can take a strip of DNA, label it red on one end, blue on another end. We call this hybridization, and run it through micro channels like you have here. And you see this little restriction down in the bottom? I can focus an optical system with my lasers that will make this red fluoresce and this blue tag fluoresce, and I can count every DNA molecule that's been labeled one by one as it moves through the channel. Okay. This is what we call quantitative molecular ecology, and it's having these type of tools to help us understand microbial processes and to prospect in nature for new microorganisms, new enzymes for biofuels, bioenergy. So I've given you some examples of how this relates to biotechnology in terms of the different processes that we're looking at. I'm showing this again to underscore we've got all of these different components that we have to pull together. What I really like about Cornell is that I can find people here, and people who are part of our coalition, that are working on every aspect of that system. This is the beauty of working here at Cornell University. We have considerable depth in plant science, molecular biology, microbiology, engineering, physics, and chemistry to make it happen. Pulling the teams together to make it happen. We still have to look at it from a broader picture. So what I focused on so far is just the bioconversion technology. There's a whole lot of good work that needs to be done in feedstock logistics. Let me give you something to think about. The team here at Cornell is pretty much focused on cellulosic, not corn-based ethanol, corn-based biofuels. Cellulose materials like switchgrass, reed canary grass are not very dense. I'm not going to be transporting this material across the country. At most, I'm going to be transporting it 35, maybe 40 miles. So this whole question of feedstock logistics becomes a big question mark for us. If I'm building this bioconversion facility, it's going to be capital intensive. That facility has to operate 350 days a year. How do I deliver feedstock to this facility 350 days a year? I've got to have a certain amount of storage capacity. I've got to deal with a certain amount of diversity. Breeding program. How to get better crops out there. So you have all heard the president and members of Congress talk about switchgrass. And switchgrass is a grass that we can grow here in New York, but it's one of many perennial grasses that we can grow in New York. Currently in New York, we can get 4.5 to 5 dry tons per acre. The breeders are saying that we can get that up to 10. But I want to underscore that we have not done the breeding programs necessary to get the high yields. And again, this is where Cornell can play a major role, helping produce the next generation of energy crops that we're going to use in our conversion system. So we've got scientists and engineers across the spectrum that can play a major role in making this happen. And part of that is educating the next generation of scientists and engineers that we're going to do this. This is my core team here at Cornell. It's a team not only of students from my department, but students from civil and environmental engineering, plant pathology, molecular biology, helping us move this forward. I made a comment yesterday because we gave a tour of the Biofuels Research Laboratory, and I told my colleagues yesterday, and I'll tell you folks today, I don't do any work. Okay? It's these young folks that keeps dragging me along, forcing me to do things. And I suspect that's pretty much the same for Anthony. But he's younger. He does a little bit more work in the lab. Okay? Open innovation, folks. How do you bring great minds together to think outside of the box? Okay? Okay? And thinking outside of the box is what we have to do as we move forward with this bioenergy initiative. So I'd like to thank you for your support and your interest. We'd like to open up the floor for questions. Anthony, come on up.
Larry,
Louder, so we've got a big audience.
different plants produce different amounts of sugar. And what actually determines that? And are the plants that produce more sugar better for biofuels?
So when you say sugar, you got to be careful about that definition.
Okay, all right, well.
So when we talk about sugar, sugar cane will give you sugar in simple monomer form. Grasses have the sugars tied up as a polymer. And so what we're looking at is the cellulose and hemicellulose content of the plant material. So cellulose is a polymer glucose, and those molecular machines that I showed you earlier are depolymerizing the cellulose. Hemicellulose is a polymer of 5 carbon sugars, primarily a sugar called xylose. Okay? And one of the challenges in biofuels, whether you're talking about ethanol or hydrogen, is utilizing both the xylose, which represents about 40% of the potential sugar, and the cellulose, which represents 60%. And we can change the chemical composition. We have a colleague by the name of Jocelyn Rose over in plant biology, and one of his major focus is how do you begin to alter cell wall structure and cell wall chemistry. So we can do that through genetic engineering. We can do some of that through breeding. Okay, yes?
A related question. The dominance of sugar cane and corn as the feedstock for today's ethanol industry, sugar cane in Brazil, corn in the U.S., is it because it is easier to convert to ethanol than other biomass, and the fact that we know how to grow it in large quantities today? Is it a superior biomass, or is it just more convenient right now?
Well, corn is about 5% simple sugars, and sugarcane is about 25%, 20 to 25%. So it's the low-hanging fruit. Now, as Larry said, cellulose and hemicellulose count for up to 70% of plant biomass. So there's all of this material that's not even being tapped at the moment. And so we're taking the stuff that we don't have to really do any processing on and just simply extracting that straight off. So we're leaving a lot of material still to be utilized, and that's why the focus on cellulosic ethanol production, where we're trying to tap in that even if we were to go with cellulosics into sugarcane, we'd still have more than 40% of the sugar left over that we could tap. So there's a lot of opportunity there, regardless of the plant material.
Let me just finish up with an answer to your question. Yes to your first comment about easy to do. Okay, we have a corn-based ethanol industry today because we know how to do it. Okay, and we know how to do it somewhat economically. Okay,
It's politically speaking.
well, I won't get into that. My colleagues, I'm already in enough trouble with U.S. Department of Agriculture. But let me put another spin on this. Corn-based ethanol is industrial biotechnology practice big time. And we can learn a lot about managing enzymatic processes, fermentation process for what's going on in the corn-based industry. But the team here is very much focused on cellulosic. Let me just give another response. Ethanol is one fuel we can produce from biomass. We have companies like DuPont that are interested in butanol, and as you heard me say, we can produce hydrogen. So a lot of work is being done on these different fermentation systems to produce other fuels. And the last comment I'll make in response to your question, I can look all of you dead in the eye, and I can tell you I can make ethanol from cellulosic materials today. I can do that. Technically, I can do that. If you ask me if I can do that cost effectively, I will say no. So I tell my engineering students, and sometimes the microbiologists have to listen to this. They don't like it, but I tell them that engineers are God's gift to mankind. Okay. But then I say engineers are accustomed to working with clients and groups that are concerned about the social, economic, cultural issues. So you can come up with the best enzyme, the best system. If you can't convince people that you can integrate this into our economic and social life, it's not going to go anywhere. There was a question back here. Yes.
Early on in your presentation, you noted that there was an industrial bio approach to this and a thermal bio approach to this, and you mentioned that the interest here is in the industrial approach.
Industrial biotechnology approach.
Yes, because that's the orientation of the faculty. Has there been an analysis of which has the greater cost effectiveness long term in terms of actually large scale production?
That's been part of a really large debate that's been going on at the national level. So let me take this angle first. First, we always get what I call the flavor of the week. All right. So 1 week is hot on butanol, next week is hot on biodiesel from algal, and then all of a sudden is gasification. In a review that I participated in about 3 months ago with the Department of Energy, they were talking about the capital cost outlays very comparable for the industrial biotechnology and the gasification process. One of the reasons you're seeing more talk at the federal level about the industrial biotechnology is strictly financial. Financial in terms of the Department of Energy has had a limited budget to push bioenergy. Okay. So part of our problem, folks, is that we have not invested in research and development. Okay, let me just finish up with this one part of that. So Department of Energy 6 years ago had to pick winners. And they decided that their top priority would be the industrial biotechnology platform and then the thermochemical platform. Now, different groups will disagree on whether that was a wise decision or not, but it's really based on getting the R&D funding out there to do it. You're going to say something out there?
If you look at Brazil's ability, Brazil has more than 50% of its liquid fuels coming from biomass. And 25 years ago, the cost of ethanol from biomass was about 3 times the cost of gasoline. Today in Brazil, it's on par. And that's because of the investment in research and development. And so when you ask, are these competitive economically, we have to say, are they competitive today? And we have to be looking towards technological innovations that are going to make them competitive tomorrow.
I'll give you another angle on this too. So we often get in these situations where we talk about either or. And that's really not what we're looking at. So one of the themes that's near and dear to my group is industrial ecology. It's a very popular theme in Europe. How do you cascade materials and energy flow to get more efficiency out of the systems? So I really believe you're going to see hybrid systems. You're going to see industrial biotechnologies integrated with thermochemical technology to create these industrial ecologies. So I'll give you an example of this. After I go through and extract my sugars, do my fermentation, I still have lignin and other solid materials left over. Those materials can be diverted into fertilizer production. They could be diverted to gasification, combustion, combined heat and power. And so what we're really looking at is integrated energy systems, which is really fascinating for me because my very first big project here at Cornell was about energy integrated systems.
How effective is the scientific community as such at educating the political community as to the right way to go? Because we've listened for the last basically 2 years at politicians talking about what they're going to do to solve the problem. And my concern is there any scientific basis for what they're saying?
You want to take it first?
It's always a challenge, and outreach to Washington is a fine art, not a science. And so one of the things that we do very well at Cornell is place our graduates. In fact, I was just meeting last week with a microbiology graduate who's on the Agriculture Committee's staff, Senator Harkin from Ohio. And so placing intelligent people that are well educated and able to translate the science into policy is a real key. So many of the scientists that we're producing here, not 50%, but a number of them feel the need to be engaged in public policy, and that's one of the avenues that we open up. And so, are we effective? No, we're not. Can we be more effective? Yes. We haven't found a magic bullet yet. If we could, we would shoot them with it.
Well, so I'll give you another angle on this. Okay, first and foremost, we are very fortunate here at Cornell to have a really effective government affairs program. Steve Johnson is the Vice President for Government and Community Affairs. And we have a woman in Washington by the name of Diane Miller, okay, that I frequently interact with. And folks, it's really great to get into Senator Clinton's and Schumer's office, some of our representatives from Central New York, and they are listening. I used to say when I first started this about 6 years ago that I feel unclean when I come back from Washington. That was the wrong attitude. Okay, when I'm finding that when I am going in and talking with members of the Central New York delegation, they are listening. And they're listening very well, and they can be very influential. For many years, we had Sherry Bowler representing upstate New York, and he was the chair of the Science Committee. Going in and talking with Bowler's staff was a lot of fun because they were knowledgeable, they will listen to us, and it worked two ways. He had a staffer, a chief staffer, that I would go in and talk with, and I'd make my Cornell pitch. Then he would say, Larry, very good. Now let me tell you how things work here in Washington. And so I would always get an education. So we are interacting very actively with members of the Central New York delegation, trying to keep them in the loop on some of the things going on here at Cornell. But they're not only interested in what's happening here at Cornell on the campus with the research, they want to know how we're playing in communities and what role we're playing in economic development within these communities.
Larry's modest, but he's head of the Northeast Regional Sun Grant Program. And that is a program that I've seen grow out of nothing, and in large measure I think it's due to efforts of individuals like Larry who have been trying to educate our legislators. So it takes a little while to convert that interest on the part of legislators into dollars and to convert those dollars into real world achievements, but the process is underway.
Well, one thing I've come to appreciate is, again, there's an old saying in Washington, is that there are two things that you don't want to see made. And you know what I'm going to say? Sausage and legislation. Yeah, all in the back. Yes, Busher.
3 or 4 months ago, the Cornell Society of Engineers put on their annual conference, and the subject was energy, alternative energy sources. And they brought people from around the world. It was about a 3 or 4 day series, and very interesting. But they went through all the alternatives, and of course they looked at coal, they looked at wind, they looked at solar, and they mentioned biomass. But the consensus of the group, when it said which is going to be the real solution, wind and solar came out high on the list. Biomass wasn't really discussed in that kind of detail. How do you see in the future, how's that going to stack up against the other things when some of the technology gets further developed?
Cornell professors are not oblivious to having their flavor of the week as well. Okay. Yes, or people from around the world. It's always interesting to get into these debates about what it's going to do, what wind is going to do for us, what solar is going to be. And I'm really fascinated about it because the bottom line, we need it all. Okay. If you look at what power demand is going to be like for the next 15 to 20 years, it's going to be unbelievable. Okay. They're talking about China needing to produce a power plant a week to meet its expected growth. So we start making these artificial distinctions. Part of that has to do because we're competing for funding. Okay. So we start making these distinctions. Well, you know, wind is much greener than biomass. Photovoltaic is much greener. Okay. I will come back to my earlier comment. We're going to see a diversified energy system, and you're going to have wind, you're going to have solar, and you're going to have biomass. If you ask me today to tell you what fraction of this is going to come from biomass, how much is going to come from the wind, I can't begin to tell you. It's not in my crystal ball. But I will tell you, we're going to need all of the technology. And it's not about just producing power, which we get with wind and photovoltaic. It is about producing liquid fuels. It is about producing combustibles. Here.
Number one, I totally agree with you. There's never only one answer. You've got to have everything. And then at the risk of dating myself, prior to your arrival here in '79, I remember studying about the photovoltaic or solar panels. I mean, they've been around probably at least since the 50s, or if it's not earlier. And I think it's a matter of educating the population as to what's there and to use it. Now, I can remember going into Europe and going up a flight of stairs, and at each level you had to turn the light on again.
Yes.
And it was in Europe where, mostly I guess Philips, that designed the compact fluorescence. But we have been so, I don't know if it's greedy, lazy, what have you. There have been many of these answers out there which we have not used. And I've been living since graduation in Los Angeles, where I know they used to have what they called the red car, a train that went everywhere, where I guess General Motors got them to rip it all up and put in freeways. I mean, we've gone, the public and the politics have gone completely counter over the years to preservation. But although you remember back in Carter's day, he was talking about conserving energy. That's why, and then it got ignored. I mean, it's amazing how all of a sudden it's like a new thing. It isn't.
No, but it's been evolving. So you mentioned photovoltaic. There's been very dramatic drops in cost of photovoltaic, electricity from photovoltaic.
Yeah, and that's the problem is the cost.
Over the last 15 years, and it continues to drop. Okay, my wife and I are looking at getting solar cells for our house here in Ithaca, because we see where it's getting to the point that it looks fairly economical, and we're kind of greenies on one side. Okay, a lot has to do with research and development, folks. So you look at the investments that, as a nation, that we've made in renewable energy broadly. I'm not just talking about biofuels. I'm talking about wind, solar, photovoltaics, across the board. Investments at the federal level have been flat for the last 20 years. And corporate investment in this has dropped very dramatically, by 75% over the same period. So give you some numbers to think about. The U.S. Department of Energy has a program, the biomass program, out of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. That budget has been humming along at about $90 to $110 million a year for the past 7 or 8 years. Okay, average $100 million. The governor of New York, the previous governor, alone invested $35 million here in New York on cellulosic biofuels. $35 million from one state versus 100 nationally. That's not a lot of money, folks. And so how do you drive the technology engine if you don't do the R&D? And I'll come back to you.
I'm incredibly impressed with what Cornell's doing, with what David talked about yesterday. As a fellow geologist with Frank Rhodes, I have a platform of the history of the Earth. I've taught for 30 years paleontology and geology. I challenge you to think of a problem we have today that isn't based on the fact that there are too many people. We are not looking at the real problem. We have the earth cannot sustain the number of human beings that, and I'm not advocating birth control or anything else, I simply think that that's an aspect of this whole thing. We're trying to solve problems without really looking at the fact that the earth can't support energy, anything, down the road. I think it's a good idea to think about that as part of the problem.
But that I'm going to agree with you. But that problem is on the table, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. And what we're trying to do is find ways that we can manage that through energy, through agriculture. Because you're right, we are artificially supporting a population above the carrying capacity of the planet. But that is because we've been able to do this with energy. Okay? And without having a reliable, affordable source of energy, we can't do that. So I've been missing my colleague here. Yes?
A question. I've understood for a long time that it takes almost as much energy to produce ethanol from corn as we're going to get out of it when we put biofuel in our cars. Do you have any idea today
So,
in your research of what might be a more efficient biomass? Obviously, sugar cane is ideal.
This is the net energy issue, and one of my distinguished colleagues here at Cornell, David Pimentel, has been responsible for that argument. Okay. What's fascinating for me about the work that David has done is that it's very difficult to verify his numbers. Okay. And I've been at it, and others have been at it. There's a whole body of literature out there that would suggest that corn-based ethanol is a net winner. Okay. Not by big, though. Okay. And that's the issue with corn-based ethanol. So let me give you some numbers to think about. Give you the range of numbers. So my dear friend David Pimentel, there was a really good paper that came out in Science about a year ago, looking at fossil fuels input compared to the energy you get out by the fuel. Okay, so energy output from the fuel divided by fossil fuel input. David Pimentel's number is about 0.8, saying you get 20% less out than what you put in. Okay. Okay, my colleague Bruce Dell at Michigan State University is saying you get 2 out for each unit you put in. So I got the spectrum here. And I know Bruce as well as I do know David. The consensus is that that number is really closer to 1.3 for corn. Now, I haven't said that. The numbers for cellulosics are even more crazy. Okay, David Pimentel is saying 0.6, saying that cellulosic is a 40% loser. Okay, and then on the other end of the spectrum, my colleagues are saying Bruce Dale again is 10. That you get 10 times out of what you put in. The general consensus is closer to 6. Okay.
Well, it must depend somewhat on how you produce
It depends on a number of things. It depends on what kinds of assumptions you make about the technology that's being used. It makes some assumption about how you draw on the boundaries. It depends on some assumption about how you feel the technology is going to evolve. It plays out with a number of factors with this. I have tried over the years actually to stay away from that debate. And one of the reasons why I've stayed away from that debate is that, again, technology is developed to respond to problems. You can't take a static look at photovoltaic, wind, biomass. You've got to look at what are the barriers, What I was talking about here today are some of the biological barriers, and how do you meet these barriers to make a system work? And this is what I fault my colleague, David Pimentel, for. Okay. He does not take into account what is going on with our breeding programs, our genetic engineering programs, with the industrial biotechnology and how that's going to change the landscape. Let me give you one example of that. It's not an energy issue, but it's an economic issue. 6 years ago, the Department of Energy contracted with 2 enzyme companies, Genicor and Novozyme, to lower the cost of enzymes for cellulosic ethanol. They started with a benchmark that it would cost $5 per gallon just to deliver the enzymes for cellulosic ethanol. Do some really good engineering and research and development, they dropped the cost down to 25 cents per gallon. Okay? All right. That's what research and development can do for you. A couple more questions. We still got about, take 2 more. Yes, here.
I guess my question is related in some way to the last statement and question, and that is there a trade-off between producing food and producing biofuels?
I would argue that sustainable agriculture today is important for both fuel and food. If you look at food production suffer from the same problem that we've had with energy. We have not put the dollars on the table to come up with the next generation of crops that we're going to feed, to deal with issues of nitrogen fertilization. So I'd be the first one to say that we've got to ramp this up across the board in agriculture. I gave you some numbers earlier about the U.S. energy budget, okay? And I told you that 2% of the national energy budget is going into agriculture. 1/3 of that energy is in the form of nitrogen fertilizer, okay? And where's that nitrogen fertilizer coming from, folks? Natural gas, okay? This is why it's so crazy for me. I keep people arguing about the cost of food, and they want to put the blame on biofuels. Farmers now are looking at an escalation, big jumps in the cost of fertilizer, and it's logical. Natural gas jumps the cost of fertilizer. But you don't hear that as part of the national debate. Where is the bulk of this fertilizer produced? It used to be here in the U.S. Not anymore. Okay? It's in China. It's in the Middle East. And so when you start hearing these issues, because we tend to get associated with one bullet, we lock into that one bullet, the system is much more complex. And you've got to look at these global drivers. You've got to look at where these resources are going to come from. And one of the things I'm a big believer of is that 2 things. 1, if you give a man a fish, he'll come back. If you teach him to fish, he'll be self-sufficient. Okay? I think that's an important part of that. And number 2, we got to start looking at regional development. What resources do we have here in the Northeast versus what we have in the Midwest? What resources do they have in Indonesia that we don't have here? What do we have in Brazil? And so the problem is much more complex than just boiling it down to these sound bites.
Just to give